Iran just delivered a message that has sent shockwaves across the entire Middle East. This was not a warning. This was not a negotiation. It was a blunt, 48-hour ultimatum that could decide the fate of the Gulf for the next half-century. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Qatar, four of the richest oil powers on earth were suddenly forced into a choice that has no safe outcome. Choose America. And Iran says the oil fields will burn. Choose your oil, and America's military protection disappears overnight. No middle ground, no delay. And the clock is already ticking. Because behind closed doors, through intelligence channels and secret meetings, something else was said in that message. Something far more dangerous. A threat that could turn the entire Persian Gulf into a battlefield of burning oil and collapsing economies. But almost nobody is talking about what happens when those 48 hours end. Before we break down exactly what Iran's ultimatum means for the Gulf, we want to welcome you to Currency Archives. If you enjoy understanding the hidden economic forces shaping our world, consider subscribing. Think of it like joining an old friend who calmly sits down with you and explains the real story behind global money, energy, and power. And before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from today, because this story might affect energy markets across the entire planet. The message arrived quietly, but its meaning was impossible to ignore. Across the Persian Gulf, four governments received the same communication within hours of each other: Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Qatar. The message was short, direct, and unlike anything these governments had faced before. Iran had given them 48 hours to make a decision that could reshape the political and economic future of the Gulf region. The choice was simple in wording, but extremely dangerous in consequence. Continue allowing American military forces to operate from Gulf territory or protect the oil infrastructure that keeps their economies alive. Because according to the message, the two could no longer exist together. For decades, the Gulf monarchies had followed a careful strategy. They welcomed American security partnerships while maintaining cautious relations with regional powers. This balance allowed them to enjoy economic growth while avoiding direct conflict. American aircraft used Gulf airfields. American naval forces operated from Gulf ports. American missile defense systems protected strategic cities and energy facilities. At the same time, Gulf leaders avoided openly confronting their neighbors. Their goal was stability. Their prosperity depended on uninterrupted oil production and global energy exports. But the ultimatum changed the rules of that system. The message Iran delivered was not framed as a negotiation. It was presented as a consequence. According to the communication, American military operations were being supported through Gulf territory. Aircraft were flying from Gulf air bases. Drones were operating from Gulf airfields. Logistics networks were moving equipment through Gulf ports. From Iran's perspective, this meant something very specific. Neutrality no longer existed. If military operations against Iran were being supported from Gulf soil, then the states hosting those operations were no longer neutral observers. They were active participants. And participants in war, according to the message, would face economic retaliation. But the retaliation described was unusual. Iran did not threaten Gulf military bases. It did not focus on naval fleets or air defense systems. Instead, the message identified a different target: oil infrastructure. The message listed it clearly: oil fields, refineries, export terminals, pipelines, and storage facilities. Everything required to produce and export oil. Everything that powers Gulf economies. Everything that supports government budgets, national development plans, and social programs. The message explained that if American military activity continued from Gulf territory after 48 hours, those economic assets would become permanent military targets. They would be attacked systematically, not once, not symbolically, but repeatedly until the infrastructure was no longer operational. For Gulf governments, the meaning of that threat was clear. Their economic systems depend on stable oil production. Oil exports fund public salaries, national infrastructure projects, and large-scale development programs. If oil production stops, government revenues collapse. If export terminals shut down, global buyers turn elsewhere. If pipelines are destroyed, production cannot reach international markets. Unlike military facilities, oil infrastructure is extremely difficult to relocate or protect completely. Pipelines stretch across deserts. Processing facilities operate in open industrial zones. Export terminals sit along coastlines where tankers must load cargo. Even a limited disruption could cause serious damage. But the ultimatum created an even deeper strategic dilemma. American military partnerships have long been the backbone of Gulf security. American air power protects regional skies. American naval forces patrol shipping routes. American intelligence networks monitor regional threats. If Gulf governments removed American military access, they would weaken the very security system that protects their borders and cities. Yet keeping that system in place might expose their economic lifeline to sustained attacks. In other words, the choice presented by the ultimatum forced Gulf leaders into a decision they had carefully avoided for decades: choose the alliance that protects their territory, or choose the infrastructure that funds their entire economic model. Both options carry enormous risks. And the most dangerous part of the message was not the threat itself, it was the deadline. Because once those 48 hours ended, the balance that had protected the Gulf for decades could disappear overnight. The ultimatum forced Gulf leaders to think about something they rarely discuss in public, the true fragility of the system that built their wealth. For decades, the world has viewed the Gulf as a region of enormous energy strength, vast deserts filled with oil reserves, massive refineries processing millions of barrels every day, endless lines of tankers moving through narrow shipping routes toward Asia, Europe, and North America. But beneath that image of power lies a very delicate network. Oil wealth does not simply come from the ground. It moves through a chain of systems that must work perfectly every single day. First, oil must be extracted from underground reservoirs through wells that operate under extreme pressure. Then it travels through gathering pipelines to processing facilities. From there, it moves to refineries where crude oil is converted into fuels and industrial products. After refining, pipelines transport the products to export terminals along the coast. Finally, giant tankers carry the energy supply to international markets. Every step in this chain is essential. If even one major part stops working, the entire export system slows down or collapses. And unlike military bases, oil infrastructure cannot be easily hidden or relocated. Oil fields sit exactly where the resources are buried. Pipelines stretch across hundreds of miles of open desert. Processing plants operate in large industrial complexes that are visible even from satellite images. In economic terms, this makes oil infrastructure what strategists call a fixed asset target. It cannot move. It cannot disappear. And protecting every mile of it is nearly impossible. This reality has quietly changed the nature of modern conflict in the energy world. In earlier decades, military strategies focused on destroying armies, air forces, or naval fleets. But in the modern global economy, economic systems themselves have become strategic targets. Energy infrastructure is one of the most powerful pressure points. A country can possess advanced weapons, strong military forces, and modern defense systems, yet still face enormous damage if its economic engine is interrupted. This is particularly true in the Gulf. Many Gulf economies depend heavily on energy exports. Oil revenue funds, government budgets, social welfare programs, national development plans, and large infrastructure projects. It also supports public employment systems and large-scale modernization initiatives. When oil production flows normally, government revenues remain strong, but when exports slow down, economic pressure appears almost immediately. Government income declines, national budgets tighten, large development projects face delays, and investor confidence begins to weaken. That is why oil infrastructure has become one of the most sensitive strategic assets in the entire region. Even limited disruptions can create serious consequences. Energy markets respond quickly to uncertainty. If traders believe Gulf production is at risk, oil prices can rise sharply within hours. Shipping insurance costs increase. Energy importing countries begin searching for alternative suppliers. Financial markets react with volatility as investors try to measure the scale of the disruption. This sensitivity makes oil infrastructure an extremely powerful economic pressure point, and history has already demonstrated how vulnerable it can be. In recent years, several energy facilities in the region have experienced attacks using drones and precision-guided missiles. Some of these weapons cost only a fraction of the infrastructure they target, yet their impact has been enormous. A small number of successful strikes can reduce production capacity, interrupt export flows, and trigger global market reactions. What makes this strategy particularly powerful is that it does not require sustained military confrontation. Instead of fighting large battles, the strategy focuses on disrupting economic systems that countries rely on every day. This approach turns infrastructure itself into the battlefield. For the Gulf states, that reality creates a unique strategic vulnerability. Their prosperity is tied to energy exports. Their national visions for economic transformation rely on stable government revenues, and those revenues depend heavily on uninterrupted oil production. That is why the ultimatum placed oil infrastructure at the center of the crisis. It targeted the single economic system that Gulf governments cannot afford to lose. But the pressure created by this threat extends far beyond the region. Because when Gulf oil production becomes uncertain, the entire global economy begins to feel the shock. And that is exactly why the next question facing Gulf leaders is far more complicated than simply choosing between two options. They must now decide how to protect both their security alliances and the economic system that sustains their nations. Inside the royal courts of the Gulf, the ultimatum did not create panic. It created calculation. For decades, leaders in Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, and Qatar had carefully constructed a regional strategy built on balance. They relied on American military power for protection while maintaining cautious diplomatic channels with regional rivals. This strategy worked because it allowed them to avoid choosing sides completely. They could host American air bases and naval fleets while still maintaining economic and political relations across the region. It was a delicate system, but it provided stability. The 48-hour ultimatum shattered that balance. Suddenly, Gulf leaders were forced to consider a question they had successfully avoided for years. What matters more to their survival? Security guarantees or economic continuity? The security structure of the Gulf region has long depended on the presence of American forces. U.S. aircraft patrol the skies. Missile defense systems protect major cities. Naval fleets guard critical shipping lanes in the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz. These systems provide deterrence. They signal to potential adversaries that any direct attack on Gulf territory could trigger a larger military response. For smaller Gulf states, this protection has been essential. Their populations are relatively small compared to the scale of their economic infrastructure. Oil fields, refineries, and ports stretch across vast areas of open desert and coastline. Protecting every one of these sites with local forces alone would be extremely difficult. American security partnerships helped solve that problem, but the ultimatum introduced a new risk. If Gulf states continue allowing American military operations from their territory, their energy infrastructure could become direct targets. And oil infrastructure, unlike military equipment, cannot be easily replaced. Building a refinery takes years. Constructing pipelines requires enormous investment and planning. Export terminals represent complex industrial systems that cannot be rebuilt overnight. Even limited damage could slow production and reduce export capacity for long periods. For economies built around energy exports, such disruption would create immediate financial pressure. Government revenues would fall, national budgets would tighten, and large development projects could face delays or cancellation. At the same time, removing American military access carries its own dangers. Without U.S. forces operating in the region, the security architecture of the Gulf would change dramatically. Air patrol coverage would shrink. Naval presence in key waterways would decline. Missile defense coordination could weaken. For leaders responsible for protecting both national security and economic prosperity, the choice is extremely complicated. Analysts often describe this situation as a strategic dilemma. Every option available carries risk. Maintaining the current alliance structure protects Gulf territory but exposes economic infrastructure. Reducing American access could protect oil facilities but weaken long-term defense partnerships. A third option might appear possible, attempting to partially comply with the ultimatum while preserving some level of cooperation with the United States. But even this path presents difficulties. Military logistics networks are deeply integrated into Gulf infrastructure. Air bases, command centers, and supply systems cannot be easily separated or restructured within a matter of days. And the ultimatum does not offer partial solutions. Its language presents a clear binary choice: end American military operations from Gulf territory or accept the consequences. That clarity places extraordinary pressure on Gulf decision-makers. Their economies are deeply connected to global markets. International investors watch their stability closely. Energy customers rely on predictable exports. Any sign of regional instability could trigger financial reactions. Currency markets may respond. Energy traders may begin adjusting supply expectations. Insurance costs for shipping through the Gulf could increase. These pressures mean the decision facing the Gulf monarchies is not simply a regional issue. It carries global economic implications. The leadership of these states must weigh immediate economic risks against long-term security relationships. They must evaluate whether the threat described in the ultimatum is credible and whether the consequences of ignoring it could become reality. Most importantly, they must reach this decision under severe time pressure. 48 hours is barely enough time to assess military intelligence, consult international partners, and evaluate economic scenarios. Yet, the clock continues moving. And when the deadline arrives, the entire structure of Gulf stability may depend on the choice they make. Beyond the royal palaces of the Gulf, another group was watching the situation very closely: energy markets. Because what happens in the Persian Gulf rarely stays in the Persian Gulf. The region sits at the center of the global oil system. Every day, millions of barrels of crude oil leave Gulf ports and travel across oceans toward major industrial economies. Asia depends heavily on these shipments. Europe relies on them to stabilize its energy supply. Emerging economies use them to fuel factories, transportation networks, and electricity generation. This constant flow of energy supports the modern global economy, but that system works only when supply remains stable. Even small disruptions in the Gulf can create immediate reactions across international markets. Traders track every signal coming from the region. Shipping companies monitor risks in the Strait of Hormuz. Financial institutions study the potential impact on inflation and industrial production. When uncertainty appears, markets react quickly. If oil production in the Gulf becomes unstable, prices can rise sharply. Higher energy costs increase transportation expenses. Manufacturing becomes more expensive. Food production costs also rise because modern agriculture relies heavily on fuel and fertilizer. These changes ripple through entire economies. Inflation pressures grow. Consumers face higher living costs. Governments must adjust economic policies to control rising prices. That is why global energy stability depends heavily on uninterrupted Gulf exports. The ultimatum introduced a new level of uncertainty into this system. If Gulf oil infrastructure becomes a target of repeated attacks, production capacity could fall dramatically. Even temporary shutdowns would remove millions of barrels per day from the global supply. The effect would be immediate. Oil prices would likely surge. Energy importing nations would scramble to secure alternative supplies. Strategic petroleum reserves might be released in an attempt to stabilize markets, but those reserves are limited. They are designed to manage short-term disruptions, not long-term infrastructure damage. A prolonged crisis would force governments to rethink energy security strategies. Countries that depend on Gulf oil would begin accelerating diversification plans. They might increase investments in alternative energy sources or expand partnerships with other oil-producing regions. At the same time, shipping routes through the Persian Gulf could become more dangerous. If tensions escalate, insurance companies may raise coverage costs for tankers passing through the region. Some shipping firms could even avoid the area entirely. This would slow global energy transportation and increase costs across supply chains. Financial markets would also react. Energy companies, commodity traders, and industrial corporations would face uncertain operating conditions. Investors typically respond to such uncertainty with caution, which often leads to market volatility. Currency markets could experience fluctuations as countries adjust to rising energy costs. In short, the consequences of the ultimatum extend far beyond the Middle East. It introduces the possibility of a structural shock to the global energy system, a shock that could affect fuel prices, industrial production, transportation networks, and financial markets across multiple continents. But there is an even deeper implication. For decades, global energy security has relied on a basic assumption that despite political tensions, the Gulf region would continue supplying oil to the world. That assumption has helped stabilize global markets and allowed businesses to plan for predictable energy costs. The ultimatum challenges that assumption directly. It suggests that energy infrastructure itself may become part of geopolitical competition. If that becomes a long-term reality, the world could enter a new phase of energy uncertainty. And for global business leaders, policymakers, and investors, the question becomes unavoidable. If the Gulf is no longer guaranteed to remain stable, what replaces the system that powered the global economy for the last half-century?